Well, first of all, thank you everybody for joining. If you have questions, there is a Q&A tab. That's usually easier for us than putting it in the chat, though we are happy to answer questions in the chat as well. It's just the Q&A tab kind of keeps it all in one place. There are no stupid questions. So if you have anything that you're wanting to know about teaching AP Lang or even like an honors or pre-AP class, that's totally fine because I know Tim and I don't just teach AP Lang, we have other classes as well.
You know what? If you want to ask really hard theological questions, I'm down with that too, because that's the other class that I teach as well. Okay. But actually, just one other thing here, real quick, Beth, is that, Beth and I don't only have expertise in AP Lang and whatnot. We do. And it's not only just honors and pre AP. I mean, I used to teach remedial freshman English almost exclusively. So we're happy to answer whatever questions y'all might have, but obviously we know that most of them will probably be AP Lang related. So anyway, back to you. Super sorry.
No, it's totally fine. All right, so just waiting for some questions to come in. But while we're waiting for those questions, one of the things that Tim and I had kind of talked about, which I guess we can kind of dive into, is this idea of should students write about appeals, and if so, how? Because that's something that I have been getting a lot of questions about because I have been doing TikTok. I don't know if any of you are on TikTok, but our students are on TikTok.
And
And
the Garden of English is on TikTok again too, and I'm disgusted by that. I hope you all that are listening are disgusted by that. I'm disgusted by that too. But you know what? Beth actually convinced me last time, and she used an incredibly logical argument, by the way. But or sorry, she presented a logical argument. She said, Tim, if kids are just wasting their brains away on TikTok, can't you at least give them a little bit of educational content that might actually go their way? And I was like, maybe Beth is right. And so Garden of English is back on TikTok, but Beth is blowing me out of the water there, as she should, because she's embraced it, and I've really tried not to. That's for sure. But anyway, back to TikTok, back to the appeals. Tell your story, and then I'll jump back in.
all right, awesome. So I actually had a video get a lot of like engagement, some good, some bad recently because I used a trending sound and I was like, basically telling students don't write a paragraph about logos, ethos, pathos because Tim and I have seen it before. You guys have probably seen it where students write an essay and each appeal has its own body paragraph and those tend to fall flat if we're being honest. And if you teach students to do that, that's okay. We have some suggestions though about how to make a more thought-provoking, engaging essay. And so if your students are on TikTok, we would both appreciate a follow because we're trying to interrupt the dancing and the spam and all these other like
That
crazy.
doesn't mean I won't dance. I might dance, okay? But my students would be mortified. They'd be like, "Freitas, no, then we're done." But anyway, sorry.
I won't dance. Although I did like unofficially agree that my current AP Lang students, because a lot of them are dance team members and cheerleaders, I have all girls this year in AP Lang because there was a schedule conflict and the two boys that had signed up couldn't take it. And I was super upset because though they're in a different class of mine, but I really wanted them in that class. And so I have an all girls class of AP Lang and they're like, when we graduate, you have to do a dance with us. And I like tentatively agreed. So I have like 2 years to learn, a year and a half to learn how to dance.
There you go.
So anyway, on TikTok, students are asking a lot of questions about the appeals, like, what do you mean we're not supposed to write about them? And I think people kind of misunderstand that advice. It's not that we don't want students to address it. It's just that we don't want it to be their primary focus. And I think the way that makes the most sense to me, at least, to explain it is to tell students that choices create appeals. So whenever I'm like guiding class discussion, especially with some of my like younger students or like my 10th graders, they're not that young, or like my novice writers. And I ask, what do y'all notice about the passage or something? And someone's like, logos. It's like, okay, great. And then let's back that up. So how do you know the writer's being logical? And then usually they'll tell me something like, facts or statistics or maybe even the examples. And it's like, okay, yes, that's what we want you to focus on, not just uses logos, because that just does not sound good in an essay oftentimes. And it kind of like runs out of steam really quickly. So that would just be like a really quick bit of advice there is really have students recognize that choices create appeals. And actually, I've got some content for you teachers as well. I've got a video about it and a blog post about it, and I've got video notes about it. So in case people are like, oh, I really want to help my students with this, I think it can be valuable for students to know that it's not that we don't want them to ignore the appeals. It's just that they're not the star of the show. They're like, I don't know, the side dish. That was the analogy I gave the other day that the kids kind of latched onto, is they're like, oh, so it's like the side dish and the choices are the entree. That made sense to them at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning. So it worked.
And what I'll do is I'm going to actually give you a couple activities that I do in my class a little later on today when we talk about ethos, pathos, and logos. And just some ways to get kids to know what they are, but not actually use those words. And we'll check that out in just a few moments. I forgot to mention at the beginning of our show here, but I'm going to mention it now. Please note that these are always free. These will be free through December. They will always be free. However, people do contact Beth and me enough to say, are there small ways that we could support the Garden of English or Coach Hall Writes and whatnot? And so one of the things that we started when we first started doing these in August is we said, hey, if you Venmo us support $15 or more, that we will offer you 3 YouTube video notes guides for just donating to us. Okay. And so if it's $15 or more, and those can actually be sent. I'm gonna put the PayPal and Venmo in here because people have wanted to do PayPal or Venmo. The thing is, though, is that when I put those in the chat, you have to put a comment with it that has your email address. Last month, we had like 20 people donate, and I only had the email addresses of like 5. So I had to like contact people, and I had to try to get them through Venmo. And then someone was like, "You never sent it to me," and I was like, "I didn't have your email," and I was trying to contact you. Go look at the comments, and it was kind of like a big fiasco. And that's not what we want. We want it to be applicable to you. So this month's 3 videos for me deal with our rhetorical analysis, thesis statements, rhetorical analysis, topic sentences, and rhetorical analysis quote integration. And the videos are all free on YouTube, that's for sure. These are just video guides that you could pass out to kids for sub plans or things like that, where the kids can actually fill them in as they watch the videos to take in the content and whatnot. Beth, I think that yours this month are rhetorical analysis commentary. What are yours?
So I have one about writing about the appeals. One is about commentary. It's more about commentary in general, I think, but I think the video does focus mostly on rhetorical analysis. And then my third one is writing a rhetorical analysis body paragraph, because I know I'm starting that with my students. Well, we've already kind of done it in AP, but my 10th graders were doing their first like major body paragraph this week. So I figured other people might need that information as well, because I think that's where, for me, that's where I see the most improvement is when I focus on a body paragraph rather than having them dive into an essay. Like I want to master or have them master things at the paragraph level. Especially because I don't know about anybody else, but my students, especially the 10th graders, when I'm like, okay, let's write a paragraph, they're like, how many sentences is that?
Oh, I know. Oh my god.
It's actually about the quality of the content.
Yeah.
And I get why they ask it, but we have, I guess, I don't know if anybody else experiences that, but from 9th grade to 10th grade, and possibly even 10th to 11th, there's a jump in expectations, and students kind of need to leave behind what the junior high or middle school expectations were. And it's like, okay, now that you're in these rigorous high school classes, a paragraph is going to look a little bit different than maybe what it did in previous classes. So we're tackling that issue in a couple of my classes this week. So I figured that video might benefit others as well, those video notes at least.
All right. Also, one other thing here, Beth, is that we do have 3 questions in now, so probably best to approach them in order. And once again, by the end of our time today, I will give some activities that I do to kind of help get excuse me, the ethos, pathos, and logos out of the vocabulary of kids, and we'll talk about why. The first one that showed up was about the conclusion of the rhetorical analysis essay. And so the person was asking, hey, can we go over what a good conclusion kind of looks like? I've got my method. I'm pretty sure you've got your method. If you want to address the way you do it first, I'll do it second. No problem at all. And then what we'll do is we've got a strong verbs question, and then we have a writing conference question too. So we'll try to, fly through those, but offer the best advice that we can. So the first one that we'll do, though, is we'll take care of the conclusion for the rhetorical analysis, because that's probably where a lot of people are.
Yes, awesome. So here's the thing about conclusions. I'll be honest, some of my students don't write them in timed essays. They just don't have the time to. Even as we get closer to the exam, I still remind them that the body paragraphs are where they get the bulk of their score. But I do have some students who can write a conclusion, and those students are like, I want to know what I should be thinking about. And I think a lot of times students assume they need to restate their thesis, which can be helpful if they're worried that it wasn't defensible the first time. But let's be honest, a defensible thesis is a really open term for a lot of the AP exams. Very many students get that point. So I think for me, if I want students to expand beyond just restating their thesis and kind of summing up their essay, which is a really short essay, by the way. So when students are like, and so does this and this to convey their message, it's like, it feels a little flat, like you just told us that. So
Yeah.
I have students try to think about the broader context as best they can. And I will usually give them a couple of questions to think about. So one would be, is this passage historically relevant? And this doesn't apply to every single prompt, but some of the ones I like to teach in my class, I'll have students think about the historical context. For instance, we read FDR's Pearl Harbor speech, and a lot of students that are taking a push know about that. Even Bush's 9/11 speech, students have heard about 9/11. And so they're able to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about the implications of the speech in terms of a historical timeline. And so that can be an interesting way to
Oh, Beth,
add new. Yes.
I want to pause this for just one moment. Okay. And I'm sorry for interrupting, but this is just clarifying something in the chat. Anybody who donates this month gets 3 different videos than what you got last month. So you have access to last month's file, and you're going to have access to this month's files too. So that's kind of how it works. So we had 3 videos last month, and now we've got 3 new videos this month. Sorry, Beth, go back to your business. My bad.
All right, no worries. So I will ask students to, if they can, situate it in a historical context. Some students do really well with this. I try to incorporate that into my lessons as well. I made a point of that for the past couple years to really get students to think about the historical implications, because I realized that was something that I didn't always do. So I've been really trying to get students to either um, do a little bit of historical research. A couple weeks ago, we were listening to a podcast. I've shown them like quick video clips just to get the historical context there. That way they can kind of file it away in case they need it. Another question that I might ask students, especially if the prompt deals with the message, is like, is this message relevant today? And some students really like to connect the message to current events if they can. There are definitely ways to do this where it can be very meaningful, and then there's ways to do it where it comes across as really simplistic. But we've had some prompts recently about, perseverance and identity, and these are like kind of abstract concepts that students can connect to in a broader way. And I like to see them do that in the conclusion. I also tell them, if you know you have a really good thought that you want to include, but you know you don't have time for your conclusion, possibly just use your last body paragraph. Use that like ending commentary to conclude the essay. I've had a couple students do that where I could kind of tell if they had more time, they would have put it as a conclusion. But since they didn't, it was kind of like that's how they ended their essay, and it worked in those instances. But that would be my advice, would be either the historical impact if it's relevant, or just looking at the overall message and its broader context relevance. Those are the two that my students tend to do well with for conclusions.
So when I teach conclusions, I do it, similar ideas to what Beth just projected, but I try to give my kids steps, right? So everything I try to do in my classroom is either templates or steps. And sometimes people have an issue with that, um, particularly because they are like, oh, Tim, how are you teaching kids to be their own writers if you're giving them templates and steps? And I'm like, well, they need to know how to write. It's almost as if you were fighting with somebody. And so, if someone's going to write well, they need to know what goes into good writing. It's just like playing scales. When you're first starting to learn how to piano, or when you're starting to learn how to play the bass and you want to do some awesome solos, it's really nice to have scales to come to the beginning. So I like to use templates. I like to use steps. And even if they're a little bit repetitive at first, I will teach them how to then deviate from that. The same thing with scales or like warming up and things like that. But nonetheless, if a kid can play scales and can play them well, they sound pretty cool. And so I feel like writing templates are the same way. So when it comes to conclusions, what happens is I give my kids the learning process as steps to a conclusion for rhetorical analysis. And so the learning process is you gain knowledge, you project understanding, and then you have wisdom because you've been able to practice understanding. So those are the three steps that I want my kids to go through for their conclusions. And so what that means is that their first sentence is going to deal with the ideas that the author was kind of projecting throughout the paper, right? Now, this is not a restatement of purpose. It's going to just project ideas. And I try to get my kids to do it with style, in that I try to get them to create some sort of pertinent metaphor. So I remember I was teaching chapter 9, and I'll bring this up a little bit more later, of Fast Food Nation. And there's a section called "What's in the Meat," and it talks about how, like, there's crap in meat and it poisons kids with E. coli 0157H7. And when my student wrote a first sentence of an intro paragraph, her first sentence, when I said, "Hey, listen, let's talk about the knowledge here. What does Schlosser want us to know in terms of ideas, but do it with a pertinent metaphor?" She started her conclusion with, "Throughout chapter 9, Eric Schlosser forces the audience to wade through the cesspool that is the American meatpacking industry." Now, the ideas that she wanted to talk about were actually greed and apathy, but she turned that into the cesspool of the American meatpacking industry. So, because of that, because of that, it was really, really well done. But this is the idea of the knowledge part. What are the ideas? Establish a relationship between those ideas. So the next thing, another one that my kid did for the Abigail Adams prompt was the letter to her son while he was traveling overseas. The first sentence was something along the lines of, Abigail Adams, throughout her piece, helps her son navigate the tumultuous seas of adolescence. And so she creates this pertinent metaphor here that's meant to do that. But anyway, so the point being, knowledge is that first sentence for me. They then have 1 to 2 sentences to produce an understanding, which becomes this idea of, okay, knowing that adolescence can be so hard, here's the understanding that we can project it to all people. So they stop talking about Abigail Adams, or they stop talking about Cesar Chavez, or they stop talking about Eric Schlosser. And in the second and third sentences, they have to start shifting towards, here's the practicality for all individuals. And then the last sentence has to be something that's wisdom. And I'm like, you can know that your last sentence is good because it will read like it would be on a fortune cookie, and you'd be like, oh, I love that fortune cookie. And so that's kind of a fortune cookie-ish moment. But I also force my kids to put a pertinent quote from the text in that piece. And so the way that my kids remember the steps are the learning steps: knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, and just going through that practicality. I did post a link to the video of how I do that with rhetorical analysis with the Cesar Chavez piece right here. But I actually follow those steps with every conclusion that I have. In fact, I had a student last year text me, and she's at Wake Forest right now, and she was in her writing class, and she texted me and said, "Hey, look at the comments that my teacher put on my rhetorical analysis paper." And the comment itself was, your use of a quote in that last paragraph and the last sentence was amazing, right? And then her brother texted me from Vassar in just like a week before, and he was like, "My professor's telling me that I should just write summary conclusions, but I really want to do what you did instead." And I said, "Look, it's your class, do what you want." And sure enough, the professor wrote back, "Best conclusion I've ever read from all the students in your classroom." And I was like, "Dude, I told you, just think about those steps of knowledge." And it allows the kids to have a little bit of fun, but they really think about putting a quote, something like that's as concrete in the text as possible, in the global scheme of things in that last sentence. They know they're not allowed to say the author's name in that last sentence. It has to be applicable to lives right now. So if they're reading the Gettysburg Address, well, they can't have a conclusion about 1863. It's got to be a conclusion that says, we look at this piece from 1863, but we can apply it even right now. And I call it channeling your inner Cinderella. So that's kind of how I roll with conclusions there. And like I said, the video is there as well. So good. I think we took care of the conclusion question. The next question that came in was at 7:04. This says, my students are struggling with strong verbs. I don't think they know the definitions of the words, so the use of them seems out of place or awkward. Is there a way to remedy this or any activity? I have an answer to that, but Beth, I'm gonna let you try to answer it first. Well, not
Okay,
try to. I'm
so
gonna let you answer it first. Not try
it's
to.
okay.
That sounded terrible. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. So I've done two things that kind of help with this. One is an actual activity, and the other is just something that I do in my classroom. As far as the thing in the classroom, I have a word wall, and I know a lot of teachers are like, "Oh, word wall." I was kind of that way. I started it because we were required to in our district, but I reference that word wall a lot. So I have certain commentary verbs, and I am a low budget teacher, so I wrote the verbs on index cards and I kind of stuck them on my cabinets that I have. My students look at that quite frequently, and I tried to put them in an order where they were kind of grouped in a way that was helpful for students, and kind of color coded. So that's one possible solution. But an activity that I did, I haven't done it recently, but I think it was helpful a couple years ago when I tried it, was kind of having the students take verbs and putting them kind of like from the, I guess, like, I don't want to say weakest to strongest, but I don't know. I've seen teachers do it with tone words, and I tried it with like verbs, and it kind of helped. It was a very quick activity, but basically, it was trying to get students to understand the difference of words. Like, obviously, we don't want them to use says, but like says versus claims versus contests or asserts or whatever. So they had to kind of think about the meaning or connotation of the word, because saying like suggests versus, I don't know, maybe like emphasizes, like those kind of have different meanings depending on how
Oh,
we use
wicked.
them,
But
you know?
one of them's implied, and one of them is so clear.
Right.
The emphasis is always clear. The suggest means it's subtly implied, right? And so I
Mhm.
think that having that's a great activity, Beth. If you actually give kids the choices of two words, like here's a sentence, which one works better here, based on the reading, and then have them pick that connotative word. I mean that I don't know. I'm like, oh, I gotta
You and
try
I
that.
might have to come up with something
Yeah,
for this.
absolutely.
Because it was basically the way I had thought of it initially was I was asking students in class, like we were doing something and I was putting their ideas of words on the board. And I asked for like, what's another way to say, and then whatever the verb was. And whatever my students were saying was like not what I had actually wanted. So we kind of made a list, and then we kind of talked about, okay, like what is the difference between these words? And then we kind of did like a little like timeline thing. So yeah, if people think that's helpful, then maybe Tim and I will come up with something to share with y'all. But basically, it was just like the different meanings of the words, because kids were starting to put words in that they had seen used, or that like something, or maybe we had used it once in class and they were kind of like applying it to something else. And while I appreciated the effort, I also wanted them to understand that not every word can be used interchangeably just because we've talked about it in class.
Mm.
So that's just my little activity. But if you have ideas, also, if anybody who's like watching, if you have good ideas in the, like, put them in the chat. It's not
Yeah.
just you and I here. Like, this is our, like, I don't know, does everyone else call it PLC? That's what it's called at our school. But like the
Yeah.
meetings where we meet as a department, like this is what we want it to be, teacher chat. We want to have like other people's ideas too. So if you have a
Mm.
suggestion, feel free to put it in the chat.
Beth, maybe we should start a group about that. I don't know. Anyway, so nonetheless, I forgot to mention one other thing for the conclusions, and this actually works really well with the word wall kind of thing that you brought up. In the a couple of years ago, and I didn't start this year, probably because I'm an idiot, but I remember this working well last year. Sorry, 2 years ago, when we were in class, because we during the COVID kind of lockdown, we actually had school. When we were in class, I put up a blank sheet on the back wall, and I wrote on the top conclusion ideas. And one of the things that I had my students do is whenever we read anything in class, I always asked them to label what the author was doing in the conclusion. And so when we first read the intro to Fast Food Nation, the very last thing that Slosher does is he basically repeats a cliche, but he ties it to kind of like not wanting to be, he uses the "you are what you eat," and so my kids were like, "Oh, he repeats a cliche," and I said, "Okay, you're allowed to do that in your conclusions then." And then whenever we read anything, at the very end, I would say, what happened in the conclusion? We read a piece by Deborah Marquardt in her last paragraph. She tells a story of her own grandparents. And I said, good. Okay. So it's a familial anecdote. So we put that on the conclusion list. And I'm like, when you write your conclusions, you can use a familial anecdote. And the whole point of doing this was throughout the year was that never once did we write, oh, the person summarized his or her paper before. Didn't happen. And I'm like, if all the best writers that we're reading do not summarize their points and their conclusions, why the garbage are you told to summarize your points and your conclusions? So, but what was also really cool is because I kept that sheet on my back wall, what ended up happening was the kids knew that they could just look right there when they wanted to know their, like what they could have for options of conclusion. So that's another way to kind of bring conclusions. That's another kind of way to bring conclusions to the forefront there for that person. Now, for verbs, okay, if your kids are struggling with verbs, the first thing you want to make sure is that when you give them a verb list, that you weed it down. Because if you do a quick Google search for a verb list, you're going to get 250 verbs. And your kids are going to be like, I'm going to use lampoons right now, or I'm going to use bamboozle, or I'm going to use all this other garbage, right? So I created my verb list, which you can get for free, by the way, if you just go to thegardenofenglish.com and sign up for our email list. It'll send you files of verb lists that are nice and colorful. You can print them out and whatnot. But I created my verb list because I took a 250 word verb list and I said, okay, what verbs do my kids most likely know and which ones should they know? So that means I need to teach them in my class. And I narrowed down the 250 words to, I think, like, I don't know, between like 50 and 70. And so you have full access to them there for laying. The other thing too, though, is this: if you realize that your kids are going a little bit too hardcore with the verb, you can give them a list of 20 and say, don't go outside this list right now. Just say it's completely off limits. Now, your kid who's born going to Harvard is going to be like, I don't want to use one of those 20 words, right? And that's when you, like, out of the corner of your eye, you give that person a little wink and you're like, you're okay. And then you move on with your life, okay? I'm not talking about making this mandated for everybody, but if you the majority of your kids are struggling, right? I tell my kids that the easiest way to get them into writing literary analysis or rhetorical analysis is to just use the word presents as their first verb. And so my kids are like, oh, so-and-so presents a comparison. Now, obviously, the better verb is compares. But my kids aren't ready to always think about that yet. And I'm like, okay, I'm thankful that you at least said presents a metaphor and not uses a metaphor. Or so the verbs that I find that are the best off the bat are presents, includes, describes, details, and then for the effect, I give them 3 verbs they can use: highlights, showcases, emphasizes. So I have verbs for the effect side of things and verbs for the kind of concrete language side of things. And I think those probably, what did I just list off? Like 7 verbs. Those 7 verbs can pretty much do everything that the kids need to do as they provide their analysis for that.
Awesome. Hey, there's a couple questions in the chat. One person asked about if I have a PayPal. I do, but just to be clear, like Tim gives me a percentage. So like, please don't think Tim is like
not a percentage. We split everything in half.
yeah.
Tim takes 80, Beth takes 20. No. We split everything in half, folks. Beth and I are really good friends, and we honestly just want to work to see each other's businesses grow. And we really care about each other, and we try to work together as often as possible. So I just wanted to toss that out there.
Yes. So I do appreciate the question. And I do have one. That's how Tim and I communicate financially, if that makes any sense. But like Tim is not taking all the money and running with it by any means. Not that that's what that person implied by any means.
Right.
I just
wanted to clarify. Yeah.
Also, someone asked, do you read all of Fast Food Nation?
No. So, Mindy, that's a great question. I use the intro to Fast Food Nation, and the reason why is because it follows the classical argument structure almost to a T, but there are 2 variants. It has 2 webs, and its refutation, there's actually a second partition right near the end. So I show my kids like, look at this is how arguments are structured, but every once in a while you gotta be ready for the variants. So I use the introduction. I use chapter 8. I use the section called Kenny from chapter 8. And we'll talk about that with ethos in a little bit. And I use the section called "What's in the Meat." Sorry, no, a bug that kills children from chapter 9. So I just use those parts because the book is way too long when I only want to use those sections, and those sections can be read without the context of the full book. So that's kind of how I do that.
I just jotted notes down because I found almost a class set of copies of that in our storage room. And I'm trying to incorporate. I don't teach a full length nonfiction text in my class, but I wanted to do something independent for students. So
Yeah,
I just took notes on Fast Food Nation because we had copies of it, and it was so funny because the teacher whose room the storage closet is near saw me carrying them, and he's very much a lit person, and I'm like the only like laying person in our
yeah,
department. I'm the oddball who likes nonfiction. He was like, "Oh, why do you want to have students read that?" And I was like, "Why do you want to teach Hamlet?" Like,
yeah.
because he was like he hates nonfiction. I just thought it was funny. So now
And
I've got copies of Fast Food Nation.
yeah, and it's just a really long book. I will say this though, it is timeless. The only thing that would make it better, and I'm surprised they haven't done this, is if Schlosser added 3 chapters about now how social media influences life. Um, everything in Fast Food Nation, even though it was on the cusp of that kind of media revolution and was on the older cusp of it, it's still, I mean, it's still brilliant. It really just is. Um, so that's that. I am going to answer one other conclusion question that came in later before we jump to the conference question, Beth.
Yes.
Just because we were talking about conclusions at first. Someone said, would the conclusion and the metaphor qualify for the sophistication point? The metaphor itself will not necessarily qualify for the sophistication point. However, if I see a sophisticated metaphor, think about the conclusion that starts with Abigail Adams spends her letter trying to help her son navigate the seas of adolescence. That is going to send my spidey sense out. Like I'm going to be like going crazy over here because I'm like, whoa, I can't wait to read the rest of this conclusion. If the rest of that conclusion can really develop the wisdom that this paper entails and project it universally, that means that we have a consistent argument throughout the paper and the conclusion continues to project that. It's going to really help earn points with the reader to potentially earn the sophistication point. So if it's a pertinent metaphor, it's going to help, but it's not going to earn it itself. And so I wanted to just toss that out there. Writing conferences. Did you have a chance to see that question yet or no?
I did. I don't do writing conferences very often, but I have done them a couple times in the past. Honestly, like because of the way our classes are, I we have like this advisory period, and so a couple years ago I required that students come to me during that so it wouldn't take up class time. But honestly, I do think they can be super valuable. As far as like getting students to have that feedback, sometimes students are more willing to listen to like suggestions or criticism, and you get that like the ability to boost confidence. I cannot tell you how many times I've had like a mini writing conference with students, and they tell me like, oh, I'm a terrible writer. And it's like, no, you're not. You're like, you're doing great. It's just, something that can really help, I think, because it's that personal connection. So I do want to do more of them. I don't have a system that really works well with the time constraints that I have. But I do have a lot of students who will stay after class and we'll kind of do like a mini conference that way, which I know is not as formal as what some people might like to do. But I do like to have that actual conversation about their writing. It's just that for me personally, with our schedule the way it is, I've had a lot of trouble working that in. This year my numbers are a bit smaller, so I might be able to do it better. But I don't know, Tim, what do you think? Do you do writing conferences?
Yeah. So here's how I actually do it. I don't have that kind of classic, like, we're going to have a writing conference. So you all have to watch Coach Hall videos and do these worksheets while I pull you up one on one. Okay. Not that I'm opposed to my kids watching Coach Hall videos. I tell them all the time to do it. But what I do is this. The week before we write our first rhetorical analysis timed writing, the assignment, I will have already taught my kids how to write thesis statements, topic sentences, include evidence, write commentary, and write a conclusion. The way that we do that, though, is we kind of do it together in class, where I'm like, hey, let's kind of just do this. The week before our timed writing, I give them a new prompt that they haven't seen before, and I tell them, you're going to write a thesis, all of your topic sentences, one body paragraph, and a conclusion. And that's your ticket to take your timed writing. If you don't hand that in, you're not taking your timed writing until you hand it in. And so what happens is all the kids get it, they get the prompt, they read it, and they're doing this all themselves. And I have to grade papers, y'all have to grade papers, and I know that, right? So what happens at this point with that week before the timed writing is I say, you've got our double block on Monday, our double block on Wednesday, and our single block on Friday to get this essay done. Now, with different kids, sometimes I've required the whole essay. Other times I've required thesis, topic sentences, single body paragraph, single conclusion, again, just depending on where my kids are that particular year. So I do differentiate. I can differentiate with different kids too, by the way. I might have one kid where I'm like full essay, another one, whatever. But my writing conferences happen then, before the timed writing. And the kids come up to me on their own and they don't say, can you check my thesis and see if it's good? Because I tell them that I will figuratively kill them with a Nerf sword if that's the case. And Nerf swords are very dull, so it's going to take a long time. And so it's going to be painful. So nonetheless, I tell them, when you come up and ask a question, I need you to be specific. What is it that you are so unsure about? You're like, I have to ask Freitas, otherwise I can't move forward because I'm too anxious about this. And they'll come up and they'll address every single problem with me. And I typically do have a line, and that's not a problem. But what ends up happening is when one kid hears me talking about one kid's thesis, the kid behind goes and sits down, and I'm like, wait, you didn't want to talk to me? And the kid was like, you just answered the question to Billy Joe. So the kids are listening in on the conferences. I do get to conference with the kids, but it's not whole essay stuff. It's the parts that they actually really struggle with. And so because of that, it makes things really, really kind of easy for me. And the conferencing happens at least 3 times a year before they get into their timed writing. So when their timed writing comes, they've already had tons of comments with me. Also, a lot of my assignments in class are like conferences with their peers. So if I teach them how to write a thesis, I always make them trade. And I say, if these are the parts of the thesis, circle where this is, underline where this is. And then I always tell them, if your partner's thesis does not communicate what it's supposed to, it's your responsibility to fix it. So the kids have to actually rewrite the other person's thesis for that person. And then I'm like, listen, now you get to make a choice. Is yours better or the one that your partner wrote? Because that's the one that you're going to use on your paper. And so I'm trying to build in all of the I'm trying to build in all of these kind of essentially accommodations, to be completely honest with you, where I'm not the one who's fully accountable for them, but the kids own it a lot more when all of this is happening. So that's how I run conferences in my room, to deal with the time frame and to also make sure I can continue pushing my content forward, as opposed to like, all right, so we finished this and I know I want to move forward, but I'm going to make you go backwards just so I can have time to talk to the 40 kids in my 2 AP Lang classes or something.
Yeah, that's some great advice. We've got a couple comments in the chat as well. Like Stacy said that she plans an independent work day, which yeah, I know a lot of teachers who do that. I do that too sometimes. Just because sometimes you just need one.
I go, oh, that the movie day. And you know what's so funny is my kids know I never show movies. So if one shows up, they're like, Freitas has grades that are due. And it happens like once or twice a year. And I'm like, yep, you caught me.
Yeah. Every once in a while, I'll have like a TED talk, and my seniors know. They're like, "Are you grading while we're while we're watching this?" Like, yes, I am.
Yeah.
So she said, I meet with them. Students come up with 1 or 2 questions that are the focus for the conference, and yes, discussing the prompt ahead of time, like Tim said, which I think is really important. One of the teachers that teaches in our 9th grade, one of the things that I love that she tells her students is, she says, I'm not going to grade it twice. And so when they ask these sort of open-ended questions like, what should I do, or how can I make this better, and they're not really asking a content specific question, they just want that feedback, she says to them, I'm not going to grade it twice, which kind of sounds harsh. But then by the time they get to me, they're like, okay, I know that you're not going to grade it twice, so could you just look at this one part and tell me if it does this? And I so appreciate that, because it's more specific for me Because otherwise, it's kind of like you have to read the whole essay, and we don't want to do that at that moment. We want to answer specific questions. And like you said, when you answer it for one student, other people will make those same corrections as well.
I want to give one other recommendation. If you have really struggling students when it comes to analysis, because I saw that the original question was that there are only a few kids that are, there are still quite a few kids that can't handle the rhetorical analysis fully yet. One of the things that I want to encourage you to do, and this is so counterintuitive to what we think we are as teachers, but I promise you, this connects synapses in ways that I can't explain. But if your kids are really struggling and you want to give them a timed writing, first of all, I suggest the Florence Kelly piece or the JFK piece because they're both very accessible. But the day before the timed writing, don't tell them. Just be like, we're going to do a final rhetorical analysis review. Pull the piece up in class and just you talk about the piece. Read it and say everything that's going on. This is going on. This is going on. This is why. This is how. Look at this evidence here. And it might be like, death by lecture or whatever. But the very next day, when they have their timed writing, give them the JFK or Florence Kelly piece that you talked about the day before. And the reason why is because even if you gave them all of the answers, because you explained all of the rhetoric the day before, they have to execute. They have to rethink, reprocess. But they know. They really know. And then if they could put it on the paper, they have done all of that reprocessing and that revisiting of what you said to think about how you were thinking the day before because you're the expert in the room. So they're training themselves to think like that. And that actually works really, really well. I allow revisions for every essay my kids write. And with those revisions, before they do them, I pass back their essays because my kids struggle, okay, especially at the beginning, but I've never felt like they didn't have a fair shot going in. If I felt like I had a lot of kids not having a fair shot going in, I would do it the way I just suggested. But when I hand their papers back, I tell them, I will not write anything on the board, but I'm going to talk about this prompt. I'm going to read this prompt and I'm going to tell you what's going on. And you can all revise it for up to full credit, but you only have 2 weeks to do it. And I talk about it, and whatever the kids write down is fine. They can write down whatever notes they want, but I won't put my pen or my marker on my whiteboard. And the kids that redo it, I've had kids go from a 62 to a 93. And since I started doing this a few years ago, my lit and lang scores have gone through the roof in terms of getting them to the 4 and the 5 range as well. And I think it's because the kids are like, oh, I have to reprocess the information, and now I'm practicing how to do that with this kind of expert mindset inside. Kind of going through. So anyway, sorry, Beth.
No, it's totally fine. You might want to check the chat because there's a couple questions of people wanting to know what you said. So you might be able to clarify, and I'll just look at the Q&A.
Yeah.
I guess.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Let me clarify, right? They do their first timed writing. If your kids are struggling and you go through the day before your timed writing and you know that you want to give your kids a fair shot, you want to give them the same prompt that you went through. I actually give my lesson plans to my kids every day. And the day before a timed writing, I typically put some secret link somewhere where if the kids actually look at the lesson plan and click on it, it'll bring them to their timed writing prompt. And so the kids that are really paying attention do that. But anyway, it's the same one. And the reason why is because when the kids get it, they're like, did we talk about this yesterday? And you're like, yeah, prove to me that you can do it. And that is the trick. Now, I'm not saying I do that every year. I don't. Okay. But if my kids are really struggling, I will give them that. But the way I typically do it, because I think that every kid typically has a fair shake in my classroom as they're prepared. I'm not saying that they're unprepared in your classroom. I'm just saying in terms of going into it. I then do the same thing with them after I pass back their first time writing, and they get to do their rewrite. And that's how they kind of get to reprocess all of the information. So I think that clarifies it. And then when my kids are writing something before that, to also clarify, if I'm giving the Florence Kelly speech as the timed writing itself, the week before, I'll be having them write the JFK kind of practice essay in class. Thesis, topic sentences, one body paragraph, or conclusion. Or for my kids that are really, really strong, I'll differentiate, make those kids write the whole thing. Then the day before the timed writing, I'll spend some time looking at the Florence Kelly speech, and then I would give that to them the next day. That's how I would set that. How I would set that up.
All right, awesome. So we've got a couple questions. I deleted the ones in the Q&A that we had already answered, so that way we can
Oh,
streamline it
awesome.
a little bit. So if you see your question gone, it's nothing personal. I just wanted to streamline it a little bit. And there is more time. So if you have additional questions that you want us to answer, feel free to add them to the Q&A tab. So Judy asked, when students are analyzing, for example, imagery, can they simultaneously address tone and then pathos, or does each item need to be addressed individually? No, I think, and if I'm understanding the question, I like it when students have sort of like, here's the core choice that I'm analyzing. So the writer is doing this, but then like if choices create appeals and tone, that's a way for them to kind of beef up their analysis a little bit. So it's making connections as far as like how's everything working in that section if they're analyzing chronologically. So I think that's fine. I don't think they necessarily, if I'm understanding it right, I don't think they need to be separate things. I think they can all be in the same paragraph. But if I misunderstood your question, please let me know.
Yes, I agree with you 100% there, Beth. Because I think it's the, do I have a kid say so and so begins by creating a blank tone, so and so then uses pathos to blah blah blah, and then, whatever. I don't. You could string them as they go through, and honestly, right? If I don't, when I think of tone, when I have a kid saying so and so repeats this to emphasize how much he hates blah blah blah. I mean, that's a tone paragraph, but we actually have repetition. Repeats this to emphasize this. It's a repetition and a tone paragraph that goes together for the concrete and the abstract in terms of the meaning. So here's the concrete thing the author's doing, and here's the meaning that comes from it.
Yeah, so it leads to a stronger paragraph, in my opinion. And like, especially for my students who are struggling with commentary, usually it's because they're not thinking about appeals and tone as these like entities that are created. So sometimes students zero in on a really kind of narrow choice and they don't know where to go with that. And so if they're looking at contrast, okay, well, what words are being contrasted and or ideas even, and like what tone does this create? So I think it's a way to get kids to actually expand their analysis. Awesome. Okay, good. So she said it did answer it. The metaphor and the conclusion. Is it pertinent to the sophistication point?
Yeah, that was just a way. It's a step towards the sophistication point, but it's not going to actually earn the sophistication point.
Right, because sophistication has to be throughout the whole essay, so it can't just be like one tiny part that earns it. But in theory, I think sometimes when students do attempt sophistication, even if it's not going to earn the point, I have found that it just makes for a better essay in general. And in some cases, I've found that I'm perhaps going to give them a higher commentary score. I know they're separate rows, but I think sometimes their attempts at sophistication help in other ways as well. So I always encourage students, especially in like timed writes and stuff, to just kind of experiment.
Yep.
Just try it.
And this actually kind of leads to a question that showed up in the chat too that we were just talking about. Someone is asking about one choice in a paragraph, and the truth is, kids to get a row 4 commentary and evidence, they have to just talk about more than one choice. They have to talk about multiple choices. Multiple choices means 2. So you could have 2 single choice body paragraphs, and as long as the commentary is good, a kid can still earn a 1-4. So just a heads up on that. My kids typically write single choice body paragraphs. They're thorough. They typically have a topic sentence, the evidence for that topic sentence, and then they've got about 4 to 5 sentences of commentary, and then they move to their next paragraph. I do push my kids to write 3 body paragraphs. Most of my kids can by the time May comes around. And they know that they can elect to only write 2. And if they do, it's going to come from a choice that happens at the beginning and a choice that happens at the end, so they can make sure that they showed how the author built the argument. But my kids know that I typically expect a beginning choice, a middle choice, and an end choice. And this actually helps to answer the next question, which says, how can we help kids develop a strong line of reasoning in a chronological rhetorical analysis? And that's very, very easy. Give your kids sentence stems. The author begins by, the author shifts to, and the author concludes by. And I know that sounds like too simplistic almost, but honestly, it does the trick. So my kids know at the beginning of the year, Topic sentence 1, the author begins by. Topic sentence 2, the author then shifts to. Topic sentence 3, the author concludes by. And then when they put their evidence in their second sentence in their body paragraph, they need to say, for example, for instance, or take, for example, how. And so now we have this line of reasoning, which is connecting the body paragraphs together. And then where the evidence is coming in, it says, all right, now that I've got my topic sentence, I'm going to project to you that I'm shifting to my evidence so I can then provide my commentary, and the line of reasoning will come. Also, Caitlin, I put a link to a rhetorical analysis commentary video, I think, in the chat. I'll put it in there again. But I've got sentence stems that force a line of reasoning just through the commentary stems too. And I'll toss the link to that video in the chat right now. Back to you, Beth.
Yeah, so I agree with what you're saying. I think that's one of the things that has really helped my students with their writing is the chronological analysis. So one of the activities, if you will, that we do is I'll have students divide the passage. And honestly, it doesn't necessarily matter to me how they divide it. It's usually like in half or in 3 sections, but I want them to be able to explain why. So there needs to be some kind of shift in like topic or choice or tone. There's like movements, and they need to figure that out. So I'll have students kind of pair up, and I'll say, okay, I want you to divide the passage, and they agree on the sections, and then I'll have them share out. I'll write it on the board. Okay, they said they're paragraphs 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 13, whatever it is. And I'll say, okay, does anyone else have the same breakdown? And someone might raise their hand. Somebody else might say, I did it this way. And we kind of talk about it, because I want students to recognize that the writer or speaker puts the choices in a certain order. They begin in a specific way, and they continue in a certain way, and they conclude in a specific way, because they're trying to achieve a purpose or convey a message. And they're trying to do that with their audience in mind. So that creates a conversation, okay, why did they start this way? Why is it beneficial for them to start this way for their audience? So I think just having students practice dividing up the passage really helps, because otherwise they kind of go on this like scavenger hunt of, okay, I need to find all the examples of repetition, and I'm going to write a paragraph about repetition. And those don't always work out as well. So I think the line of reasoning with the chronological analysis helps. And like Tim said, with topic sentences, I will then have students write a topic sentence. If they divided it into 3 sections, then I want 3 sentences. The writer begins by this. I have a couple different sentence frames. I use, like Tim said, like they shift to this or they continue with this, but I also have them do one where it's like, having already done this, and they refer back to their first main idea. The writer then does this.
Beth, I have never even thought of that. And now I'm like, I can't wait to just steal that. Wow.
So I have that sentence frame. And like thinking ahead, there's a couple student samples. The ones that come to mind are argument and not rhetorical analysis, but I'll have students, like, if I show them the top samples, like the ones that get a 5 or a 6, I'll have them look more closely at, like, okay, look for their line of reasoning. Like, how are they using their topic sentences and their transition words and their concluding sentences? Because as much as I can give them sentence frames, sometimes they need to see another student do it. But those topic sentences are a quick grade if you need them. I know Tim and I have talked about this before, but I have to do 2 grades per week. And so sometimes it's a 5-point grade where they had to just write topic sentences, and it goes in the grade book. But it does really help. And those sentence frames give them a starting point, because I have found so many times that students struggle with topic sentences, and then they like get this like writing paralysis, and so they don't know how to articulate their ideas. And I don't want them struggling with the topic sentence. Like, I want that to be smooth, so that way they can spend their time writing the paragraph. So that's one of the reasons why I use sentence frames. And I have some in various videos. I also have resources with sentence frames that I'm happy to share if people would like the link to that. But sentence frames, I know they get a bad reputation because people are like, oh, it's like canned writing, and aren't their essays all the same? No, this is just a way for them to get their thoughts out. Their essays are not all the same.
Yeah. Couple things also at Beth. I'm happy to stay a little bit after 8 my
Yes,
time.
I can too.
Because I really want to give a couple activities for teaching ethos, pathos, and logos without saying the words as well. But I want to make sure we definitely address the questions that were here, because that's, I think, why I think people come. Let's try to address this one super quickly. but this one's really important. What would you recommend to teachers to better learn AP Lang content for themselves? Um, because of the new terms and stuff like that, or sorry, or because of terms that they're just not familiar with and whatnot, or that are new to them.
Okay, so many answers to this. I guess it kind of depends on what the struggle is right now. But you know, Tim and I are toying with an idea of like extending this conversation further. And he and I are always happy to help on social media as well. Like, message us if you have questions and things like that. And we both do different like workshops and things throughout the year. And we both have videos for teachers, like, in case people want tips as well. And I just started taking up blogging, which is a whole new world, but it's kind of fun. So I'm trying to do some teacher blogs. But there's a lot of ways that, people can come up with ideas, but I think it also gets overwhelming because it's like, okay, this person's sharing this idea and it worked. And I can imagine being a new teacher who's trying to find their way. It could feel like information overload. So for me, I think when I was just starting out, I tried to be very clear on what my objective was and what my focus was, and show myself grace along the way because we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, I think sometimes. So I would say definitely like check out the resources that Tim and I have, and ask us questions because we're happy to like send y'all links and answer your questions as well. And I would say be involved in the different communities, but just know that sometimes it can feel like information overload. But I think like trying to try a new activity, like I've been telling myself this year, like once a month, I want to try something new because I get in a rut of like doing the same old thing. So I tried, is it hexagonal or hexagonal? Probably hexagonal. I tried that, like that thinking, and I'm gonna do like a couple things later on where they cut up the passage. It doesn't have to be fancy, but just try something, to get the kids engaged, I guess. But show yourself some grace because like AP Lang teachers are super hard on themselves.
Oh, it's
Um,
crazy.
so I don't know, but that's just my like general thoughts is, feel free to reach out to us. We have resources that we're happy to share. But just like start small, and don't like, I don't know, like remember the time of year too, because like I know some of the activities that I'm doing now are very tailored to the beginning of the year because students are just learning these concepts. So take it like, one day at a time or 1 week at a time, whatever. But like, stick to the basics if you need to, like that's okay. Like if you're teaching how to write topic sentences, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that. Like our kids need the basics too.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts?
Um, all right. One thing I want to add. Sorry, one thing that's completely not related, but I want to tell people before people start signing off, folks. If your students, if you can email me and you tell me that at least 15 of your students subscribe to the Garden of English, I'm going to take your word for it. But from then on out, I'm going to give teachers and students shout outs in my videos. So if you tell your students to subscribe to the Garden of English, and at least 15 or 60%, if you've got a smaller class, 60% of them subscribe to the Garden of English that night, shoot me an email with your name, your school's name, a picture of your school mascot, and also I need to know your name phonetically so I don't botch it. But we'll put it in the next video that we make that's AP Lit or AP Lang related. So I just want to make sure that you all were aware of that. And it's not just to build my subscriber count, although that helps. But that actually helps. That helps the YouTube algorithm get our information out. But I didn't want to volunteer that for Beth just because Beth, you do what you want to do. But I know that we're doing that in the Garden of English. So if you can get your kids to subscribe, that's totally awesome for us because that actually helps get kids better information than the largest AP Lang YouTuber who does not necessarily give good information. And luckily, that's not Beth or me, so we're not knocking on anybody. Gina, in terms of your question, about kind of tips for getting you to develop better, just course knowledge for yourself, two options here. One option is, I don't know if you have the AMSCO book, but the AMSCO book looks really fat and thick and whatnot. But that's just because of all the activities that we have in there and the questions that we have. That we really break down the content really, really, really well, I think, to be completely honest with you. So I would recommend picking up a copy of the AMSCO book. You could probably just contact Perfection and see if they'll give you a sample copy or at least a sample online version for a couple weeks. If not, email me and I'll send you an autographed copy. So honestly, Gina, shoot me an email. And I'm going to send you an autographed copy once you send it to me with your address. That's not a problem. So don't even contact AMSCO. Contact me. We're going to get it out there. Okay. Um, so just yeah, Tim, I'll put my email in the chat after. Folks, I can't give out tons though, but I want to make sure that Gina feels like she has the resources that she needs. Hopefully Gina's still in here and actually heard that. So the that'd be terrible, you know. So Gina, if you could confirm, that'd be awesome. The other thing too, though, is this, and this is for every teacher. The Garden of English has an ultimate review packet. Now y'all are gonna be like, "Oh, great, he's selling us something." No, no, I'm not. Okay, listen, it is one of the few products that we do sell. Okay, but for a teacher, you can get a free trial of the Ultimate Review Packet, and it goes through all 9 units of the course and exam description. And I think it's like a week long or a 2 week long. I don't remember. All right. Now it's for you because these are sold by license, and that's per the people that own Ultimate Review Packet. I made the product for them, so they make the rules. Please don't crucify me, folks. Okay. But we go over every piece of content that needs to be known in the course and exam description. And so because of that, I really think, and we simplify it, and you have all the notes that go with it. So there are notes guides that go through the videos. You don't need that. Watch the video and then read the answers to the notes guides. And I think that you'll be very, very comfortable with the content even after that. We really tried to simplify as much as we possibly could, even down to the scoring rubrics, where I turned the scoring rubrics into questions that kids could ask themselves so that they could self-score their own papers. I also provide scoring commentary for every type of essay, so you know exactly what the case is here. And Beth, the answer is yes, I'm working on something similar for AP Lit this year, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get it out before February just because I'm so swamped with everything else. But we're trying. We're trying. Okay. So that's what I would do for those of you that are looking to get a little bit of extra kind of content help there.
Yeah, and one quick like plug because I dropped my email address in the chat and people are like welcome to email me. I do try to respond as quickly as I can, but sometimes life gets in the way, and I know Tim's the same way. But if you're looking for content that you can use in your classroom, both Tim and I have email lists, and I think we have like little different strategies. We're trying to figure out how we want to grow these lists and serve our community. But I will put my link in the chat, and I try to send links, or sorry, not links, emails like every week or every other week with just suggestions for people. Like, here's what I'm doing in my classroom. Here's a blog post or a video or a free resource. Every once in a while, I do share some paid content, but I try to provide as much value as I can without that. So I'll just put the link in the chat. And I know some of you in here, I think, are already on that email list. So hopefully it's been helpful. And I'm sure Tim can share his as well. But we try to, we're trying to branch out and share our ideas as best we can, not just on our social media pages, but now through email as well.
Yeah, and just so y'all know, I am not going to populate my email list. You won't get emails from me more than like once a month, just because I just am way too busy now that my youngest son plays hockey. That's like a cult. Let's just be real. Gina, here's your book, by the way. I'm going to sign it as we speak. And like I said, email me and we'll send that out tomorrow. Okay. Don't worry about shipping or anything like that. We'll take care of all that. We want to make sure that you're super comfortable in your classroom. So did we miss anything else? Because what I'd like to do is I would like to go over a couple ways of teaching ethos, pathos, and logos.
I think
like just a couple
got
quick
everything. Yeah, someone asked, this is going back to some of the transition words. They asked, is it advisable for students to say, for example? And yes, I think they can when it's appropriate. Tim also gave a couple other ones, like for instance, and take, for example, how, but yeah, sometimes they just need to. And those transition words really do help with line of reasoning. There's other ways to lead into it without, for example. So we don't want them to overdo it, but yes, they can say, for example. But transition words are something that I know students know, and they need to know for the AP Lang multiple choice. There's a couple in the writing section that deal with transition words. And for those who are having students prepare for the ACT and SAT, they have those kinds of questions as well. So I try to go over like how to appropriately use certain transition words with students. That was one of the questions. It might have been in the chat, but someone asked about multiple choice. So just really quickly, I try to work it in around my other lessons. Like if I have a gap or like a flex day or something, we do it. And I had intended to do multiple choice Monday this year, but I haven't started it yet. And the reason is because a couple years ago, students said it was super helpful. We were doing it for the ACT, not necessarily AP Lang, and their scores were great, but they were like, "Yeah, we kind of burnt out." But then when we took the test and we realized it was helpful, we really felt like you should do it with your other students next year. And I kind of took that note of like the burnout though. So I think you can definitely incorporate multiple choice, but I try to do it. Where I just kind of weave it in around other things, or sometimes, especially for like ACT stuff, I'll do like a question of the day sometimes, or I'll try to incorporate ACT grammar questions into lessons in other ways, but I don't do multiple choice regularly or in a very formal way. It's just kind of when I could fit it in. Because I just feel like if I do it throughout the year, it does better than just doing like a whole multiple choice unit. I think that would be too much for my students.
And Beth, I'm going to just talk about multiple choice here real quick myself. One of the things that I do is I have my kids write multiple choice questions. So I just give them stems. And then I tell them, when you write your questions, here are the stems, and they'll always be appropriate to whatever we're reading. And I tell them, you need to write one answer that's half right, but also wrong, one answer that's correct, but not for this question stem, one correct answer, and then one answer that is an overly generalized version of the correct answer so that it's wrong, but it could potentially be right. And I don't make them do a fifth answer, but the reason why I do it that way is because those are the three types of lead distractors that they typically see on their exam. So my kids are actually practicing for multiple choice, even though they're writing their own questions, without me having to do death by multiple choice. So that's the nature of that. You can still hear me, right, Beth?
Yes. All right. I was just trying to answer a question in the chat.
Yeah. Jennifer, your question about the skill deficient kids, I couldn't tell if that was either AP Lang or ninth grade that are skill deficient, but I'm going to just tell you this. Okay, so the ninth graders, right? So first of all, I never assumed that my ninth graders knew anything about anything. So I taught from the bare basics the whole time. The other thing that I did was I read all their IEPs and I gave every kid the exact same accommodation. So every kid gets the same exact accommodation no matter what. Small group testing, they all get offered small group testing. And if half my class is gone, so be it. Half my class is gone. Now, some schools might deal with that differently than I did, that I mentioned. Oh, Heather, I have a video. If you search lead distractors for multiple choice on Garden of English YouTube, everything's listed out for you right there. Promise it, guaranteed. But anyway, the other thing too is this. I didn't start having a really awesome AP Lang or AP Lit classroom until one day I sat down and I said, I'm going to teach my AP Lit class and my AP Lang class just like I teach my remedial freshmen. So I said, what do I do with my remedial kids? I'm going to do exactly that in my AP Lang classes and my AP Lit classes. And that year, boom, straight to the top. So honestly, the best way to do it is to assume that they know nothing, give them all the same accommodations, and really, really, really break everything humanly possible down. And I think that you're going to be like, wow, this makes my life way easier. I mean, I kid you not, my kids in AP Lang probably read 20 different articles in the whole year. That's really not a lot for an AP Lang class. And people are like, oh, but you're not getting your kids into culture, A, B, C, or D. And I'm like, my kids have serious writing skills. The last thing that they need to do when they go to college is worry about their writing skills. I had someone who wasn't even a parent pull me aside the other day and said, I'm in a book group with a parent of a child who used to be in your classroom. And that parent was telling me yesterday that her child is the only person who doesn't struggle in college. And she's always like, because Freitas taught me how to write. Not because Freitas gave me 40 articles to read or 50 articles to read or whatever, but because he taught me how to read and write, and I used 18 articles to do it. So I mean, honestly, my AP Lit people, just so you can get a perspective here, my AP Lit students read 3 longer works all year, sometimes 4, but they're Jekyll and Hyde, Alice in Wonderland, Macbeth, and Frankenstein. So they're all super short. And then we probably read a total of 12 short stories and 15 poems. But we dig into every single one to get those kind of skills out. So just kind of if you compare yourself to other people on the internet that are like, oh, time writings every Friday, multiple choice every Monday, I'm always like, I'm not sure that's the best. But the way I do it is also not dogma. So be
Yeah,
advised.
someone said in the chat, "OMG, I'm thinking I'm not rigorous enough." Or yeah, so and I think that's something that sometimes comes up is when we see like other people's approaches, we start to compare. But I agree with Tim that sometimes we need to start with the bare minimum. Like the other day in AP Lang, I needed students to write a thesis statement, and I asked them like, "Do I need to write the sentence frame on the board?" And they were like, "No, we got it." And then one person just kind of gave me a look, and I was like, "You know what? I'm just gonna write it on the board. And if y'all don't need it, you don't need it." But like they like those kinds of things. So just kind of adding those like safety nets or accommodations, whatever you want to call it, really helps. And I agree too with like not with my ninth grade because I don't teach ninth grade, but with my 10th grade, I assume that they know nothing because sometimes that has been proven true. I'll get like I had it happen this year. I'm like, oh, I was told y'all did this last year, and they're like, no, we don't know that. And I'm like, okay, here we go. So I had to go over something, that I wasn't planning on it. But sometimes you really do have to start with square one just to make sure they understand the terminology and the expectations. So it's not always about churning out essays all the time. In fact, I think Tim and I both kind of hold off on our first initial essay for a little while because we want to have
Yeah.
them write those like thesis statements, topic sentences. I do body paragraphs as well, because then the first essay is more pleasant for them to write. And honestly, I think more pleasant for me to grade.
With my group of kids this year, they're not writing their first time writing for me until the last week of October. I can guarantee it. I can absolutely guarantee it. And then they're not going to write their second time writing for me until the middle of December, and they're not going to write their third for me until the beginning of January. That's how it's going to break down, and I know it, and that's fine. I'm never worried about that because if we build the skills, we're going to be in good shape. Beth, can I talk a little bit about ethos, pathos, logos real quick?
Yes, please do.
Okay. That does not mean, by the way, folks, that I don't do timed writings. I time everything in class. So, like, if I give kids something to do, topic sentence, it's got to be done in 10 minutes. It's got to be done. So the kids are always dealing with that. Okay. But anyway, this right here, this is Macduff. Okay. And this is one of the ways that I teach ethos, pathos, and logos. You don't have to do it the exact same way. But I want to just give you a couple ways to get kids to talk about things. So this is Macduff. We talk to him in my classroom like he's a real human being. When I have a beard, I like to rub beards with Macduff. I like to kiss Macduff, stuff like that. And I make the kids talk to him, and the kids talk to him. And he actually has real human hair. And I'm like, guys, that might have come from a cadaver. And they're like, oh my gosh. Now, the reason why I do this, though, is because they get all weirded out. And I tell them, I'm like, what's your problem with me hanging out with Macduff? And they're like, it's weird. And I'm like, good. What did I do with Macduff that made this weird? And they're like, well, you kissed him and you rubbed beards with him and you talked to him like a person, right? Now, this is all good because when the kids are getting emotional thinking that I'm weird, that's the pathetic appeal, but never once do they actually say, oh, Freitas, you're getting so pathos here. You're using pathos. You're like, they never use that language. Instead, they say, you kissed them and it was weird, right? And that's actually the topic sentence that I want them to write. I want them to know what the pathetic appeal means. It's the appeal to emotions. But what emotion right now? The emotion is discomfort. And so I want them to be able to say, you're kissing Macduff on the cheek made me uncomfortable. Good. That's what I need them to say in order to precisely talk about ethos, pathos, and logos. And then I'm like, well, why did it make you uncomfortable? And they're like, well, normal people don't do that. And I'm like, good. So you're now making a logical assumption that I deviate from the norm. So we don't only have a pathetic appeal working in here. You're actually bringing some, there's some logic that's going on here. And they're like, oh my gosh. So when the kids just use ethos, pathos, and logos, they always keep them separate and they don't see how they really work together. And so I like to really bring that in where I can get them to kind of combine those kind of things. The other thing that I like to do is I had my eyes laser corrected a few years ago, but I like to tell my students about my graduate studies because I finished with a 4.0 and my focus was like in existential linguistics, although it was an MAT, but my English classes were focused in that. And I tell them about my scores and whatnot. And when I do, I put on my fake glasses. And the reason why is because my kids are like, oh, 4.0, that's pretty impressive for graduate school, right? And I'm like, oh, okay. But nonetheless, it's an MAT program. We know that, yeah, you all know what's up. But the English classes were great. And when I tell them about the topic that I studied and we talk about it, they're like, oh my word, this dude is such a nerd, right? And then I ask them, like, hey, why the heck did I put my glasses on? And the point of it is, of course, is that they all think that, nerds wear glasses. It's an ethical appeal. It makes you, quote unquote, appear smarter. Um, and so we just talk about how instead of using the word ethos, we're like, oh, you put on your glasses to appear smarter. I'm like, yeah, that's our choice. That's our effect. Does it deal with my character? Absolutely. However, right, it doesn't actually add any more logic to my argument. It doesn't make you emotional. However, if you're impressed by my graduate studies, well, that's pretty cool. You just had an emotional response, but you're also making a logical correlation. Hey, maybe I should trust Freitas as my teacher because of that. When it comes to assignments, you got to use the ASPCA commercial to teach kids about not using the word pathos, because the ASPCA commercial does the ethos, the pathos, the logos perfectly, and it's all intertwined. And so the kids can figure out they're playing that song to make me sad. They'll never say pathos. Oh, they're offering an incentive to get you to donate. Yep, that's actually a logical progression. So there's your logos there. Sarah McLaughlin, she's a famous artist. So she supports it, so you should support it. I'm like, good. There's your ethical appeal and your logical appeal at the same time. If you take care of this with just that one commercial, the kids will never use the words ethos, pathos, and logos again, but they'll understand the concepts. And that's what you want them to do. In fact, in the course and exam description in the second unit, it says arguments persuade through the appeals, the modes of persuasion. I was on the committee that helped approve the course and exam description, and or that worked with it, I should say. And we purposefully discussed not having the words ethos, pathos, and logos in there so that kids wouldn't rely on using them. Because if we use the word pathos, we have a full spectrum of emotions, good ones to bad ones. And when the kids are like, oh, the author's just pathetic there. Well, which type? The good, the bad, the indifferent? Who knows? So we want kids to really speak specifically. I used chapter 8 of Fast Food Nation with the Kenny chapter to talk about ethos and logos because Kenny and the pathetic appeal because Kenny is like run down by the meat packing company he works for, but his decisions are terrible. And so Swasher uses him to build his argument, but at one point, Kenny gets hit by a slow moving train. How was Kenny inhibited enough to not move out of the way of a slow moving train? I can't understand that. So we talk about how that actually might hurt the character of Kenny there. In the next chapter, chapter 9, a bug that kills children. There's this section about this little kid who dies from getting an E. coli infection from eating a hamburger. And it's kind of scary and whatnot, but it also proves the point logically. And so because of that, we talk about it. And then Saucer brings in the mom for that ethical appeal. All of these sections, ASPCA, chapter 8, chapter 9, you can take care of all your ethos, pathos, and logos, but show kids to talk about it precisely as opposed to actually thinking about labeling those terms. Sorry, I tried to make that as quick as I could, Beth. I'm super sorry that it took me longer than I thought.
No worries. Yeah, so I like
That's a good pledge, by the way. Sorry for interrupting, Beth.
Yeah, the ASPCA commercial. I always hated watching those, honestly, because they would like zoom in on like this poor dog and like
the eyes hanging out, the pug's eyes hanging out. I'll put a link to the the BCSPCA commercial that I use. All right. So I tried to cover that and give you a couple little lesson ideas.
Yes, and I think we answered everything in the chat as well. So just a quick plug for next month. We tried to like come up with some topics, but it's always kind of dependent on what people want to ask us about. So if you have like suggestions for either Garden of English or cultural rights or these teacher chats, let us know because we want to produce videos and blog posts and whatever it is that are helpful. So let us know what you all want to talk about next month because it'll be October. So we'll be probably in the swing of it. Some of us might be switching from like whichever FRQ we're doing now to the next one. So we're happy to talk about those things. But if you have specific suggestions or requests, let us know. And Tim had already kind of said it previously. How to transition to argument. Yes, I want to cover that because I'm going to be transitioning somewhat soon. So I will definitely be thinking about that one. But Tim had kind of already said it, but like, please, if you don't mind, encourage your students to subscribe. Both of us have YouTube channels. We both have TikToks, and it's just a way for us to grow. The more subscribers we have and the more people interact with our content, either by liking it or sharing it or whatever, it really does help the algorithm. Things I never thought I would say, but it's like,
Yeah.
it really does help. So if you all don't mind plugging that with your students, we would appreciate that. And I know Tim does the shout outs. I don't want to steal his idea, so I'll have to come up
No,
with
steal
something
it,
else.
Beth. It's a good idea, you know. And one of the things I know about this is kids contact me all the time. Hey, will you make a video with me for my class? And my answer is always yes. And then I try to put a shout out in the next video to them because I'm more than happy to interact with them. And so, Beth, I mean, it's a great idea, and it lets the kids feel like they're recognized, and that's really an important thing. Also, I saw the questions in here about transitioning to argument and whatnot. Although they're older videos, I have ways to transition to argument already up on my YouTube channel. And so there are a couple in there. I am redoing my argument series, but I'm not doing my transition to argument. I'm going from how to break down the prompt, write thesis statements, write evidence, and whatnot. So I'm doing synthesis and argument kind of stuff right now at the same time. But if you want to know ways to transition, you don't want to have to think too much about it. I've got some videos on the YouTube channel there for as well. But honestly, Beth, I think it's a great idea if you steal that, because if kids feel like they're being celebrated on both our channels, like, I don't know, I just can't imagine that kids would be upset about seeing those kind of things. And that, who cares? We're teachers. We steal ideas all the time. Don't be ridiculous, you know?
Yes. Well, and that's funny because you said that, and today you posted your new video with Crystal about writing about personal experience, and I had a blog post scheduled to go up about personal experience, and I think I shouted you out in one of the posts because honestly, like, we talk about similar topics, and some of our perspectives are the same, some are different, and
Yeah.
I send my students to Tim's channel for certain
Yep.
things too. I'm like, look, there's ways that he explains this that are maybe different. So we love it when you support both of us. We
Yeah.
really are like very appreciative of everything y'all do to support us. So if you don't mind, just encourage those the students to subscribe. I know Tim hit 10K on YouTube a couple days ago. Was it? It was pretty
Yeah.
recent. And
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
like,
hold on.
I'm almost there.
My
I'm
wife
hovering.
did. My wife does all that. She's the rock star here.
So yes. Oh, someone said once you go to argument, do you keep RA mixed in? I sort of do, but it's just because the unit that I do. But there's times where I am very like we're focusing on these skills. I do have a little bit of overlap, but it's really because of the text that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I tend to compartmentalize maybe more than other people do.
Yeah. I'm more compartmentalized. I do not fully spiral consistently. But I don't know how you can, when my kids create an argument, I always talk about the rhetorical situation, the choices that they're making to get them to think about analyzing their own choices so that they're still doing the rhetorical analysis process because I make them analyze their argument and the choices that they're going to make. They have to map it out to, all right, what choices are you going to make to get this audience to do what you want? And
Yes.
so that's still rhetorical analysis, but it's of themselves instead of other people. That's all.
Yeah, because I have found that like if if I start talking about like, okay, we're reading this, for synthesis, not argument, but it kind of applies. I've had students get confused between like rhetorical analysis and synthesis because they're like, oh, okay, do I have to analyze how this writer like I don't know, like included statistics. And it's like, well, your objective is different here. So I have found that I am very compartmentalized because otherwise students start to mix up the FRQ that we're doing. So that's part of it as well. Just like from experience, I've had students kind of like start to try to write a synthesis essay like RA, and it's like, no, we want to keep those separate. So I tend to be very like cut and dry. I'll even like, and I hope my students don't find it patronizing, but I'll even be like, okay, so we're about to start synthesis, and this is the one with the sources, and I'll like kind of remind them what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
Because like Tim, I'm so used to saying like Q1, Q2, Q3, and I know what that means, but I have to remember that they don't as well. So yeah, awesome. It looks like we've addressed everything in the chat. But like I said, feel free to reach out to us. We've both put our emails in the chat, and we both have like Instagram and all that too, if people prefer those. But yeah, we're happy to hear from everybody and happy to have such an engaged chat. I love this. I wish like our school PLCs were this engaging.
yeah. I agree.
Not to knock my school by any means, but we have a lot of those meetings that could have been covered with an email.
Yep. Oh yeah, for sure. So All right, I appreciate you, Beth. I'm gonna take off. We're gonna go home to those 5 kids and try to send out a bunch of emails. So, and I have a couple of slideshows to create too, but I might wake up early in the morning to do that. So,
All right, awesome. So yeah, if people sent stuff via PayPal and Venmo, they can expect to hear soon for that.
Yep,
And if you guys have
tonight and tomorrow
questions,
morning. Yeah.
yeah, just let us know. But we so appreciate your support. So thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you next month.
Yes. All right. Have a good one, Beth. I'm sure we'll be on the phone soon enough.
All right, awesome. Thank
All
you.
right, talk to you.